Welcome to Open Talk, an ongoing discussion of the state of photography in the age of COVID-19. I'm Travis Keys, your host, also a photographer, a New Yorker, a Sony shooter, and chairman of American Photographic Artists New York. Each week I'll be joined by a diverse panel to talk about where we came from, where we're at, and where we may be going. We do these broadcasts live so you can participate and ask questions. Well, good evening. Welcome to Open Talk. This is actually episode 13, which I'm going to say is lucky episode 13 because there's enough going on in this world right now that's just craziness. We took a pause from the whole world for COVID, and now we're taking a pause and being distracted by protests and mass, it's like cue the volcanoes next. What is going to happen next? Like you can't possibly imagine that the world would go this crazy in a matter of months and weeks and stuff like that. But just like everything else, everything's pivoting and changing. So I had two guests lined up for tonight, and one is out on the streets, Evelyn Hoxine, who will probably dial in while we're doing this. But I want to welcome our one guest that's here, and we also have another another guest that's going to join us, Jessica. And it's a journalist episode. We're going to talk about what's going on in the world right now. So a lot of times we have commercial photographers, we have wedding photographers, we have everybody from the industry. So this week is going to be really kind of focused on you guys. So I want to welcome Jamie and say hello to everybody. You're live, Jamie. Say hi.
Hi, Travis. How are you? How's New York these days?
New York is all right. It's a crazy, you always think of New York as sort of one of the center of the world spots, but with COVID as a hot spot and now with protests and stuff like that, it really is, an ongoing, it's crazy. It's absolutely crazy. So first of all, introduce yourself and tell everybody where you're from.
My name is Jamie Rose. I am the co-owner of Momenta, which operates Momenta Workshops, which is what most photojournalists know us for. And I'm calling in from beautiful Redmond, Oregon.
Awesome. And now we have Jessica. Jessica, why don't you say hi, introduce everybody to yourself. Thank you for joining us tonight. I know how busy you've been with all that stuff that's going on.
No problem. My name is Jessica Kaselniak. I'm a Washington, D.C. based video journalist. I'm the senior video journalist at McClatchy here in D.C.
So you just woke up, you've been out on the streets for the last 17, days straight, right?
It seems like it. It definitely seems like 17 days has passed.
Since Monday.
What's the mood in Washington right now?
I'm sorry, what did you say?
What's the other overall mood that you have as a journalist in Washington right now? Especially these last couple of days.
Yeah, I think now today you can really feel a shift in the air. I think the weekend was really tough for everybody. As of today, the military has pulled back into Lafayette Park, and so they're not visible on the streets. At least that's as last time I checked. But they have been, very visible, very present. And they have on Monday they forced peaceful protesters down the street using tear gas and force. So it's been a really, really tough few days here. But the mood seems to be shifting. It seems to be more peaceful. So I think everyone is hoping that the next few nights and the weekends continues to be peaceful.
Yeah. And Jamie, how are you doing? How's your mood and how's it on your side of the world?
I think I'm like everyone else right now. I feel a little shell-shocked by what I'm seeing, what I'm hearing. My heart is just bleeding for the photojournalists that I know who have been going through some really difficult time, in this coverage. And I know we're going to talk about that a little bit more in the program.
Yeah, we're going to definitely dive into that very deeply a little later on.
And at the same time, it's kind of my MO, but I am very optimistic. I think that we are going to see some real discussions coming out of this that we haven't seen in a while and we haven't really talked about. And well, I think it's so unfortunate that there's been so much violence that has detracted from the main message. I think we're going to be talking about some really important issues. I think we're going to be talking about inclusivity and diversity, but also, you know, what does it mean to have a free press?
Yeah.
And what does it mean to have the ability of journalists to freely cover the news and not be obstructed because of, you know, the many reasons that we'll talk about later. So yeah, I think we're going to have a lot of conversations that are going to be very relevant. And I think there's a lot of organizations that are going to prove to be really impressive voices for that discussion.
So I want to kind of just jump back and rewind prior to all of this so we can kind of get a little premise of where you guys came from. And we'll start with you, Jamie. Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Kent, Ohio, where Kent State is.
Yeah.
And so I grew up in kind of a really cool university town and raised by photographers and teachers. So I have sort of a artistic.
So photography was in the blood from the get-go?
Not from the get-go. It wasn't like, I wasn't one of those people who was like, I picked up a camera when I was 4 years old. I had photography around me all the time, and there was a dark room in our basement when we were growing up and all that good stuff. But I think more than anything, you know, my parents really wanted to focus on the arts. And so they made it very clear that part of a good, well-rounded education is really focused on arts and humanities. And at the same time, journalism was always part of that. It was always, you know, there was always the news on at night and things like that. So I think so that's in my blood for sure.
Did you know and kind of your path was originally photography, or was it something completely different? You were on a completely different path and found photography?
No, I always knew I wanted to be in journalism. I didn't really know. I mean, obviously in high school, I didn't really know what like documentary was. I didn't understand what the difference between documentary and photojournalism was, and photography, and, you know, magazine versus editorial versus all the other things you learn later on. But I joined the school paper. That was kind of my like first jaunt into journalism. And I had really great, amazing teachers, and we had an award-winning high school journalism staff. So that was kind of cool. And then I went on to college, and I thought I wanted to be a writer, because I kind of didn't know that like the photography part of it was more than just fun. And then I got an internship, and then I went to Syracuse, and I really, you know, that's where I really found my legs. And I had, you know, incredible mentors with Mark Dolan and David Sutherland, who beat the drum of the importance of the Fourth Estate and documentary coverage, and, you know, being able to be a really qualified storyteller with a camera. Yeah. So that was where like the path, you know, opened up to me. And then I was really lucky. I graduated from school and I went to DC.
How about you, Jessica? Where'd you grow?
So I grew up in Northwest Indiana, about 20 minutes from Gary, Indiana, about 45 minutes from Chicago. And I for most of my life, I wanted to be a doctor. I wanted to be a trauma surgeon. And my dad is a physician, and he would always, you know, he like Jamie, he would always just introduce us to the arts. And it was really important, you know, that he did that. And it's interesting because I was gonna go to college. I was gonna go to Purdue, and maybe play golf. I was a big golfer when I was in high school.
Is that right?
Yep.
Wow.
And the short story of a very long story is I got in a really bad car accident when I was 18, and couldn't play. And so my dad was in the hospital. He brought me a camera, and it was like time to go be a photographer, right? I think they wanted me to be a wedding photographer, to be fair. I think they were like, you are going to be the best wedding photographer there is. And I had already gotten into the Corcoran College of Art and Design, which is now part of GW. And so I came out to Washington, and some of my teachers were the best photographers, you know, in town. Steve Crowley was one of my professors. Susan Sterner was one of my professors. I had amazing mentors, and Jamie, and lots of colleagues, you know, that still like live and work here. So it was, you know, it was kind of amazing to be here. And that's kind of how I got started.
Do you remember your very first camera?
Yeah, so the very first camera I owned was like it was a D100, which is like the one of the first digital cameras. So like when you hear a lot of when you that like I own, like my dad, I think it was like an N something that my dad owned that I would play with, but the camera my dad bought me that was mine was a D100, which I find so funny because everyone always talks about like their first camera and it's some old film camera and it's like, you know, this relic, and I'm like, oh, the first one I had was a digital camera. So yeah.
And Jamie, do you remember your first camera?
Yeah, when I joined the newspaper staff, my dad gave me the AE1, Canon AE1. Yes, it was during the time of film, Jessica. and that was, yeah, that was the first one. What was yours?
My very first camera, I had a 110. And this was long before I ever thought I was going to be
What?
a 110, a little disposable 110. Yeah, you know that.
That's fun.
Yeah. And then I went through all kinds of different cameras, from Kodak disc cameras to ELPH cameras to, you know, I think my first real camera, my mom had a Nikon FE2, and I started shooting on that when I was at NYU, and I took my very first photo class, and that was I was there for film, and I thought I would have an Oscar by 22 or something like that, and I figured if I couldn't take a single picture, how was I going to take a whole film, you know, and make a whole movie? So I took the very first class I took at NYU was a film class, and learning how to develop black and white, and I realized right there I'm not a film photographer, and it was too frustrating in the dark room. If it wasn't for digital photography, I probably wouldn't have been a photographer at all. So
I actually really sympathize with you. I really sympathize with you.
You know, to be even more honest, if it wasn't for the Control Z, it definitely wouldn't be a photographer. Especially in Photoshop and Lightroom. Control Z is my best friend. So when you were growing up, what were some of your influences? Because I know when I was growing up, even before, you know, I loved film and TV and stuff like that, but even before I was a photographer, I looked towards like cinematographers. So I wasn't looking at journalists. I wasn't looking at, you know, famous photographers. For me, it was actually cinematographers. I loved the whole atmosphere of cinema and that kind of thing. Did you have early on influences that kind of guided you? We'll start with you, Jessica.
I think honestly, like outside of your traditional like photo books, I remember like when there used to be stand-up Barnes and Nobles. Like my dad would always take us to Barnes and Noble and bookstores, and I always used to like sit in the photo section while my dad, you know, did his thing and just like look at books. And I'd always like ask him to like get one, you know, can I get this one or can I get that one? And none of them were particularly like earth-shatteringly like amazing books, but the one that I still have and I still like chuckle about is like The Day in the Life of Africa. Like I still have like, I just remember like looking at that book and really like just thinking like, oh, this is something I want to do. And then eventually like obviously growing my knowledge as a you know, as someone that was learning about photography, to like Henry Cartier-Bresson and you know, Susan Meisel and you know, so and Paolo Pellegrin. Like I think I always, and I think that's where I learned my foundation. But no one in my family was photographers, so it was really like up to me and the Barnes and Noble, you know, when I was in high school to like kind of get that foundation. So I ended up learning a lot when I ended up getting to college.
Yeah.
And I think that's where my foundation really kind of evolved.
How about you, Jamie?
Well, I vividly remember my parents had The Joy of Photography. Do you remember that book that came out in like 1970? I think it's not on this bookshelf, but I think I have it somewhere still. Like it's this like disco layout from like, it was probably like Time Life books, you know, one of those many, many things. And then there was there was another Kodak book that I've like, of the books I remember, but
yeah,
I think
I have to interrupt you here just because, you know, I was raised by extremely strong like women in my life and influenced by women. And right now, because I said that comment, my mom had the joy of cooking, which actually was just a joke. My dad had the joy of cooking. I have to clarify that my mother was a kick-ass woman. She will probably see this, and she was a big influence on me in the arts. So I'm going to wipe that last comment. Resume.
Oh, I wasn't even taking that as a microaggression. I just thought, like, sure.
No, I'm just
Every household had that book.
exactly.
I think one of the things that was the most, that was one of the best things my parents ever did was my mom subscribed to the New Yorker when I was growing up. And so we always had that around, which is crazy because I was in this like tiny little town in Ohio and I'd never been to New York before, but like the writing and the photography and the cartoons and the commentary that was in that magazine was so eye-opening to someone who's from a town in, central Ohio, northwest Ohio, like it was such an eye-opening thing. So I feel like periodicals in general should be something that every parent has laying around.
Those old National Geographics, right? Like,
yes. Just there so that like curious kids can pluck something off of a bookshelf and just start flipping through it and find what interests them, whether it's, arts or photography or science or whatever.
Yeah, our parents definitely have them. And my mom is like, can we get rid of these yet? And I'm like throwing my body in front of them. Like, no, get rid of them.
So important.
So both of you guys took a very direct kind of, or was it direct? You guys chose to be journalists, basically. It's certainly part of your career, which is a very different type of photographer than, say what I do is, portraits or commercial or playing, with Photoshop and creating an image and being able to alter it and do all kinds of different things. How did you kind of choose that path and what do you think it is that makes someone a journalist opposed to, a photographer that's sort of like, at the whim of whatever they want to do?
Jamie, do you want to go? I mean, I can answer it.
Yeah. Both. Hopefully, both.
I love being, like Jamie will agree with this. Like, I love being in the know. I love having that first, seat to history. And there's just something about it that really fuels me. I think that it's really important, like as I have evolved from a photojournalist to a video journalist, I think being a storyteller and being able to find the thing that really connects is really important to me, and I think that's why I chose this, is because I chose it as the way that I wanted to communicate with the world.
Yeah. How about you, Jamie?
Well, I genuinely don't have the patience that you do, Travis, to sit in front of a computer for that long. And I'm not that good at Photoshop, so.
Painstaking hours.
I think I've always had, an activism streak in me, especially because of my parents. And, I vividly remember as a kid, like marching against nuclear weapons during the Cold War and being a part of social activism. So that's always been really important to me. And I mean, I'm very thankful, like just to speak from a female perspective, like I thought originally I wanted to be Annie Leibovitz because the really high-end photography that I had seen was through fashion magazines as a young girl, because, that's just kind of what's forced on you and, encouraged to like look at these pretty pictures of portraits and things like that. So like, that's what I thought I wanted to do. Yeah. I didn't really understand that there was a connection between activism and social and humanitarian issues and photography. But once I figured that out, then I was like, oh, I am all in, chips in, like all in. I want to do that. I want to be able to tell that kind of a story. And, and politics was just something that I, really enjoyed, but humanitarian work was what I really wanted to do. I mean, I always loved doing politics, but I always kind of said it like, I get to photograph like policy and then policy in action. And it's definitely gives you two sides of the coin when you realize like how complicated it is to make policy and then how complicated it is to enact it when you're on the ground with other people.
Do you think it was sort of ingrained right from the very early, because when you bring that up, for me, like when I was growing up, I loved fantasy. I loved space. I loved, documentary stuff was like, I didn't want to watch it. If it was black and white, if it was, the news or stuff like that, I didn't watch it, which is totally flipped now. I love documentaries and can't get enough of, black and white films and stuff like that. But for me early on, I was a fantasy escapist. And I think that's why when I'm a photographer, I think of these grand images and what can I do and kind of create these wonderful worlds that were in my head and make them reality. What was that for you growing up? Was like, were you into like news? Were you into documentaries, or no? It just was a flight of fancy for you.
Well, my mom was very strict about television. We were only allowed to watch 2 hours of television a week, each girl. So we would have to like find compromise with each other. And like to this day, I still remember that I liked Fantasy Island and the Dukes of Hazzard, and my sister wanted to watch like St. Elsewhere. And so, like, I remember time periods based on the TV shows that we would watch during our 2 hours. But I always really liked to read. I was dyslexic when I was in first grade. My mother was told that.
I'm dyslexic too.
Yeah, I'm actually dyslexic as well. So we're all.
Einstein, Da Vinci, Edison, Rockefeller, we're in good company.
Oh yeah. So my mom sat me down when I was in first grade and said, your brain doesn't work the way other people's brains do. And the only way you're going to learn how to read, because I loved it when she would read me stories. And she said, the only way you're going to learn how is if you teach yourself, because your school just doesn't understand how to do that. And so the second, like I trained my brain to read in the right way, like I couldn't stop reading books. So I escaped.
Here's a crazy point on that. The reading aspect is the average person wants to take maybe 5 to 10 like objects or letters in a second, roughly saying something like that, where the dyslexic wants to take the whole page in or 100 images in at a second. So we have when reading, we want to take that whole page in as a picture, opposed to now we have to literally go to the letter and follow it across and translate. So we're trying to take in everything at once. So when it comes to like putting puzzles together or being creative or something like that, in our brain, it's already done. But when it comes to actually focusing on a pinpoint spot and translating it across, it's much harder because we're trying to take in so much information at once.
That makes so
much sense. Once you realize that, it really kind of
so
changes
much sense.
Things.
Yeah. That's why I hate QuickBooks, I think. So I think everybody, I mean, Jessica, like I escaped in books. So like I would read just constantly, but I loved movies for that storytelling aspect. So I think because I wasn't watching like serial television as a kid, my vision and fantasy world or whatever was like a story as a complete cohesive project. And maybe that's, Travis, I'm totally like going to think about this for days now.
I can go much deeper into it actually, because I've actually gone and talked about it, and it's the problem is people tell you it's a learning disability when actually it's not. Most dyslexics have a much higher IQ, and we learn differently, and it's all the way we process audio and visual, and it's pretty wild, and really it's something that unfortunately the education systems don't know how to deal with it. Like when I was in school, they would say, oh, he's just lazy or he's not, performing. And that's not the case at all. It's like if they actually sat me down and forced me to take notes, I was never listening to the next thing they said. And once I said, just don't, I can't take notes. Don't let me do it. Then I remembered everything. And they're like, wait, how did that happen? So they don't understand. And the first thing they think is, oh, you see letters backwards. I'm like, no, I don't see letters backwards.
It's kind of funny. Even my editor now, like when I'm about to put out a piece, like will make him like look at it and be like, I need you to edit this. And he's like, it's fine. I'm like, no, there's probably something wrong with it. And I finally have gotten comfortable. He knows I'm dyslexic. He knows he makes time for it, because otherwise, he's like, oh, there's a mistake. And I'm like, no, I looked at it 100 times. He's like, I promise you, like, you have to go fix it. But yeah, no, it's kind of crazy.
So as all of my guests, I asked to send in some work and stuff like that. So Jamie, yours is queued up first. So I'm going to jump into your work here. And sure. as we go to different images, I would like to talk about them and stuff like that. So here we're going to go with the very first thing. As soon as you can see the screen, let me know. Can you see the screen?
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. And we're going to go into the first image here. Boom. Okay.
So you want me to talk about it?
Of course I do. Because I don't know. Yeah, it's your image. I can talk about it, but you can tell me the truth about it.
So that was my first, this was from my very first experience going out of the country and doing humanitarian work for my thesis. I was working with volunteer healthcare providers in the West Bank and Israel. And just like, I think we all have these preconceived notions of like what our path is going to be like. I totally thought like, I want to be Carolyn Cole. I want to be Andrea Bruce. I'm going to be James Nachtwey. I'm going to go cover conflict. And like the first time I even got anywhere near it, I was so terrified I couldn't work. And I realized like, this is not for me. But what I did want to do is I wanted to tell stories about humanitarian healthcare workers. That was really my passion. And
Yeah.
so
Can I back you up just one quick second?
Yeah.
How do we get from, did you go to college for this? And how did you go, what was your route to finding your first job and getting to there?
Oh, okay. Well, I went to undergrad at American University in Washington, D.C. And I majored in literature because I thought I wanted to be a writer, and then photography, you know, like I would be that like one man band of doing photo and writing and all of that. And then I had an internship at my local paper, which I always tell people is like the one thing you should definitely do as a photojournalist is go work for local news, because it really does change your entire perspective on being a member of the community and the impact that you have on, you know, people that you're going to see again. And then I went to graduate school. I applied to a number of different schools, and then I went to Syracuse and I discovered their photojournalism program there. And at that time, you know, there were so many incredible photographers coming out of it. And I had so many great influences, and I really wanted to work with doing some kind of work. And so Mark Dolan was actually one of the first people that introduced me to grant writing and why grant writing was so important for personal art projects and personal photojournalism projects. And so I started writing grants. And I started to apply for things and, you know, see how, if I could partially or fully fund my thesis that I wanted to do overseas. And so I was listening to a story on NPR. This is why Jessica's father and I think get along so well is I was listening to the story on NPR, and they were talking about these physicians who were volunteering in the Philippines to vaccinate babies, and they were kidnapped by a militant group and being held hostage, and one of them had been killed. And I was so morally outraged by it. And I was like, of all the people, you're going to take the doctors who were like taking their only vacation time to go off and vaccinate babies. And so I just decided that was something that I was really interested in covering and supporting that story. So I found this group, Physicians for Human Rights, they were Israeli doctors that were going in and helping to support Palestinian medical relief and doctors in the field. And so this gentleman and I were going to visit a family that were living in an occupied house and checking on the kids and everything like that. So it was a really enlightening experience. It really changed my path. And then I had to go find a job. So this is my like one tip to all the people that are probably, you know, feeling really, really despondent right now, the young kids who are graduating. I applied for, I think the count was finally like 35 jobs when I graduated from grad school. And one of them was to load film at a newspaper. That's all you did. Like the photographers come in, hand you film, and you load it into the processor all day long. No shooting, no creativity. You were basically a robot. And I didn't even get that job. So I just want everybody to know that like, it's always been hard. It's always been competitive. It always sometimes feels like everything's, you know, collapsing. But then I moved to Washington, D.C. and I figured out through amazing mentors like John Harrington and Nikki Kahn and Linda Epstein, who just all took me under their wing and said, you got the drive, now you just got to figure out how to get the access. And so they taught me how to get my press credentials and how to start, you know, getting myself out there. And then I, thankfully, I went to an NPPA Northern Short course and I was showing my portfolio, and I met the lead political editor for the New York Times. And he said, how come you haven't been shooting for us? And And here's another tip. At the time, they had just changed their contract and everyone was all up in arms. And I think this is like incredibly relevant today to what we are all talking about. Everyone was furious. And there was like this boycott the New York Times, and people were straight up bullying anyone who was signing that contract. People, you know, thank God Facebook wasn't really that big back then, but like people were talking around each other's backs and just being genuinely hateful to some of the people. They're calling them scabs, like they were crossing a line. And so I said, like, I'm really nervous to sign the contract because I hear it's really bad for freelancers. And Kevin sat me down and went line by line with the contract to explain to me what it was, how it would affect my business, what it would do, what the resale rights were, everything like that. And it was really enlightening, so that when somebody, you know, accused me of that, I was able to be educated enough to say like, hey, yeah, I signed it. And this is why. And I've made a lot of money on the resale, so it wasn't that bad. So I got to be in the halls of Congress and work with the most, you know, amazing photographers like Doug Mills and Stephen Crawley.
When was the first time you actually felt like, wow, I'm a legit photographer now? Like, when did you pass that kind of that realization? You're standing in front of it was you know, because standing, you know, in the room as a president with a president, you know, I remember shooting Bill Clinton. I'm like, holy crap, I got Bill Clinton in front of me and I'm shooting him and talking to him. That's there's a certain feeling that's like, wow, I arrived.
I don't know. I think for like the first couple of years, I don't know, Jessica, did you feel this way? I definitely felt like an imposter. Like, I don't really know what I'm doing. I'm just going to act like I do.
Oh, I feel that way all the time still sometimes.
All the time.
Come on.
All the time. I have no idea what I'm doing.
I remember there
I
was
just keep making it better and better and better. You know, it's like I get better, but I pretend I'm even better than I am to become that way. So I catch up, and then I need to get better and better.
Fake it until you make it. Fake it until you make it.
That was one of the best advice my stepfather told me, is like, I never accepted a job I was qualified for. I took the job and then I learned how to do it.
Exactly.
Yeah. Can you do it? Absolutely. Thank God for Google.
And YouTube.
I think, you know, the handful of times where I felt like I knew what I was doing was because somebody else explained it to me. Matthew Kavanaugh was an editor, and he helped me, you know, like the first time I shot at the White House for like a Marine One landing, and I didn't know what I was doing. And he just, I mean, this is, sure, he won't appreciate me saying this, but he was like, just expose for the fireball. And other than that, make as many pictures on Motor Drive as you can. It's pretty straightforward. And then the first time I went into the Oval, I remember Mary Calvert was standing next to me, and she knew that I was like completely out of water. Like I had no idea what I was doing. I was terrified. And I was on like New York Times rotation that day because there was some bill signing or something like that. And they did like 3 of them in a row, and I didn't know what I was doing, and I was terrified. And she looked down and she said, "What's your camera set at?" And I can't remember what I had. It was like 60th of a second, you know, at like F8, and be there. And she's like, "No, go to manual, do it this way, put it on.
Wow. So we're going to go into, I think, a couple different images here in just a second. And going from politics to scenes like this is a very different type of photography. You know, covering, you know, politics is one thing, and there's certainly enough bodies strewn around there, but this is different. And explain how.
So I had wanted to do more humanitarian work, and thankfully Jessica and I were talking about networking ahead of time. I had my boyfriend at the time was a photo editor, and he'd heard about this call for jobs, applications and proposals to apply for the Global Fund. And so I did. And it was pretty incredible. I was on a team of 12 people. There were 6 Magnum photographers and then these 6 unknown photographers like me. Surely because we were cheaper. And I was able to go and do work on AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis. So I covered tuberculosis in Bolivia, and then I went to Uganda and I covered the malaria. Well, I was covering AIDS, but as this photo shows, and what we talk about in Momentum workshops when you're doing humanitarian work, is you really need to, you know, show like the whole story. You have to show that there are tons of people being affected by this, tons of ages. You know, it's not just one person, one thing. And so I was really blessed. I got to. I
So
get to
you
cover
mentioned
really awesome.
Momenta, and I know a lot of people may not know what that is. Why don't you explain quickly Momenta?
Sure. When in 2008, Momenta Workshops was started by John Christopher Anderson. He was working as photo editor at the time, and I was working as a freelancer. And there was another photographer who was instrumental in the beginning. He was a documentary photographer out of New York, and we all got together. And Chris had this vision for a company that had multiple divisions that would focus on training and supporting documentary photographers. And so we really, we started with our very first workshop in Burma, actually 4 months after the monsoons that were so devastating, or typhoon. And then we went and covered, Uganda, and we just kind of rolled right out into doing trainings and programs for humanitarian and documentary photographers and photojournalists who really wanted to get that real world experience of working with a nonprofit for an important humanitarian story, like Jessica Kasalniak, who was one of the very first students of ours very early on in the first couple of years. She went to India and she covered a leper colony and people who were working to help people suffering from leprosy. And so we've been doing this for 12 years. It's pretty incredible.
So you've been doing it for 12 years, and the basis of those 12 years was very hands-on. So how are you adapting now to, suddenly like we're in quarantine and, isolation? How are you adapting the workshops now to kind of deal with all of this?
Well, we have online programs. Our one-day workshops have gone online. So we have a Get Funded seminar, and then we also have which is all about fundraising for personal projects. So that's really focused on like, how do you get that dream project of yours to get outside money? So we talk about personal, private, and public funds like grant writing and crowdfunding and all soup to nuts. And then at the end of the month, our first cohorts of online mentorship programs are going to launch. So that's going to be a really intensive 1 mentor, 5 people. We decided to take the best things about Momenta workshops, which is creating community. So you're going to be with 5 other people. You're all going to be focused on the same topic, but you still get one-on-one editing. So part of our programs are really based in the concept of photojournalism, like what Jessica was just talking about. Like, I have to go to an editor and say, I want, I need that editorial experience. I need to be able to like talk to somebody about my work. And so every day on our in-person workshops, you get 1 hour at least of one-on-one editing with a coach or a mentor. And then,
and sometimes it's brutal.
I have no idea what you're talking about, Jessica. I wear pussycats.
So Jessica, how did, having finished the working with Momentum, what was it like for you? What was your experience, and what did you pull out of it that kind of that, wow, every day I take that piece of information with me as a photographer?
I'm not, I don't want people to think I'm saying this just because Jamie is here, but like, I think Jamie and Chris probably have been the 2 most influential people in pushing me.
You're gonna make her cry, and I'm gonna cry.
Don't cry. In pushing me in to like keep going. Like, I think this industry is really hard, and there were times that I stepped out of it and was a freelancer and kind of had a little bit lost my way. Chris and Jamie were both like, what's your goals, right? What do you want to do? And when you're able to really like have that mentor that is very realistic and quite honestly hard, right? Like, Chris and Jamie they're realists, and if you don't, I've worked with them one-on-one on many projects, and when you're not performing your best, they're like going to tell you, right? And I think that is that honesty is the thing that propels you forward.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jess. That's very nice of you to say.
It's very true.
So when you're what gravitates you to a picture when you pick up that lens and want to hit that button to take that picture and slam that shutter down? What is, because some people it's the light, some people it's just an emotion. For you, what is it that you gravitate towards?
Well, we always talk about, like Chris always talks about, gesture and form, and then light and composition and all that. And like, I'm definitely a gesture person. Like I think it's just part of my personality. I like kind of go for who's ever making a lot of, movement and noise and everything like that. But I think as I've gotten older and I've studied more and I've, experienced the different types of technology that we have available to us right now. Like I try to follow the light a lot more these days and really, kind of waiting for that moment, which is documentary photography. I mean, you're waiting for the moment. Your whole purpose is to get really great moments. And so mine are, I kind of focus in what we do at Momenta as well. And like the next set of pictures is we're really trying to tell a story in either a single image. This is Allison Zuka's image from a group called Coach Art that is a bunch of people that do art coaching for kids in LA. So we're really looking for something that is giving you a bit more storytelling information than just a beautiful form or a beautiful light or, perfect composition. I think that's probably the hardest thing for some photographers, when they come into our programs, because they're so used to, like, wedding photographers. Everyone's gorgeous at a wedding. So it's really easy to make sure it's perfect. And then, sometimes you have to, really look for the moment. This is Charlotte Kessel's image from Hurricane Katrina recovery during one of our very first workshops ever. We've been working in New Orleans for 12 years. This is Uday. I totally mess up his last name every time. Kembakode, maybe. Uday is incredible. This was actually in Social Documentary Network's 10-year anniversary of the Best of Gallery. And so, you're looking for those little storytelling things in the background, like Sophia, who's the most famous, one of the most famous women in Colombia, and how it's, in the lobby of a Catholic charity, which is kind of funny.
The colors are just gorgeous.
Oh, so stunning. And then this is Ken Deemer's image. And like this, there's gesture, there's form, there's light, there's all that good stuff in this, but there's also this incredibly touching moment because this was a job fair at a high school in LA. And they were you can see the guy bringing around the ties to give to the kids who didn't have a tie. And then the teacher was going around teaching them how to tie the tie and make sure they looked good so that when they had that meeting, I mean, those are the type of images that just, they make me so proud for what we're able to do. And they help nonprofits grow and tell these stories. And, a lot of times in today's news, these images just these topics just kind of come and go. And when they're gone out of people's memories, somebody just said the other day, like, COVID, what? And people are still suffering from that. Businesses and individuals and humans and doctors are still struggling. And that's where, we come in. That's where we're passionate about. We want those stories to stay in the news. And whether it's LGBTQ issues or whether it's healthcare issues or, after school programs and training for kids, like that's really our mission. Our mission is to support documentary photographers, no matter race, religion, creed, background, geography, anything like that. Storytellers are storytellers the world over, and we want to get those stories out there to the public.
So we're going to jump over to Jessica, and I want to thank everybody because you weren't originally scheduled to be here tonight. Evelyn Hochstein, who you also know and is in DC with you, was supposed to be on tonight, and she's also a friend and a co-host of Around the Lens, which we both do together with David. And she is out there on the streets tonight, and it couldn't make it because I think there's something going on in Washington in the last week. I don't know what, but you do, because you've been out there on the streets and photographing. So I want to share what you've gone into, but how did you go from what was your transition into your first job, and how did you get there?
I am still, so when I graduated college, I had an opportunity to either stay in DC or go work for my local paper. And I really didn't know what I wanted to do because I thought, I thought you needed to be in DC, right? Like the best photographers are working in New York and in DC. And I, talked to my professor about it, and she was the one that encouraged me to leave. She said, you're not going to learn how to be a photographer in DC. Like, the people that are working successful in DC, they've been somewhere else. If you look at the best photographers around the country, like, they don't start in New York and they don't start in DC. A lot of them started in small towns and small papers, around the country. And so she said, you could always come back to DC, but you can't, but you need to go learn how to, like, I taught you how to be a photographer. Now you need to go learn how to be a photographer. And so I left DC and started at our local paper at the Northwest Indiana Times. It was in Munster, Indiana, which is the Northwest Indiana region of Chicago. And there's a lot happening in Northwest Indiana. I swear anything bad that happens, like, the person is like related to the region in some way, shape, or form. And it's really shocking, but it was a great place to work. And so that's kind of where I started, and I worked there for 3 years, and then I left and became a freelancer for a few years. And then I was married at the time, and I got a divorce. And this is when I started working with Chris and Jamie a little more. They said, what do you want to do? And I said, I want to work for one of the biggest papers in the country. And I'll never forget being on the phone with Chris. And Chris is like, that's like almost impossible, right? And I was like, yeah, I mean, probably, but like, that's what I want to do. And he's like, papers are like downsizing, and you want to like get off the bench and like go work at a paper. And I was like, yeah, I think that's what I'm going to do. So I actually moved back to Chicago, and about 6 months later, I joined the staff of the Chicago Sun-Times, and started working there. Worked there for 3 years. I was the lone survivor. A lot of people don't know this, of when they laid everyone off in Chicago.
I have to just say one quick thing. The reason why Chris does that, and the reason why like this happens a lot, is because a lot of people say like, I want to go work for National Geographic, and then he's like, are you sure? And then when she said, I'm sure, then he was like, let's do this, because just wanted to make sure that you were there and ready to go. But when you did, oh my God, that girl's like a dog with a bone. So please go ahead.
So I started working at the Chicago Sun-Times, and my focus was the south and west sides of Chicago, gang violence, gun violence, and then a lot of Chicago's most dangerous neighborhoods. I was the lone survivor of the Sun-Times layoff. It's actually the day I became a video journalist.
Oh, wow.
When they laid everybody off, I was the only one on staff at the time who knew how to do video. And they said, today you're going to be a video journalist. And they're like, you know what you're doing, right? And I was like, sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I had just, it's kind of crazy because I had just gone through a pretty like terrible year because I had gotten this divorce. And I had just like gotten on my feet again and like gotten a place in the city and like was really like felt like I had gotten my life back under control. And they're like, you can leave, you're welcome to quit, or you can be a video journalist. And I was like, oh my God, I have rent to pay. Like, I definitely want to like stick it to the company, but like, how am I going to pay my rent? Yeah. So it was so during that time, I just decided to put my head down. Like, there was a lot of noise. There was a lot of phone calls, a lot of noise about what had happened. And I certainly thought what the company did was really terrible and incredibly awful to legendary photographers that had worked there. But I had to put my head down because I needed a job. So I
did you work with, I know, Alex Garcia?
Alex works at the Tribune.
That's right.
But I do know Alex.
All you Chicago people know each other, don't you?
Yeah, we do. we're just competitors at heart.
So I'm going to go into the first image that you sent me here. And why don't you tell me when this was taken and some information about it?
So we're just going to jump right to present day. I forgot this one was first. So I took this picture. I took this picture on Saturday, actually. This was actually for me on Saturday when the protesting like got really violent in Washington D.C. In this photo, like you can see the smoke from these smoke bombs, but like they were shooting tear gas, they were shooting pepper spray rounds, they were shooting these like 68 caliber pepper spray impact rubber bullets at people. One hit somebody and then didn't explode and then like hit me. And I actually had it outside. Actually still have it because I was like, what is this? Then I learned it was a pepper spray round and I put it outside. But
yeah, kitty. No.
right, exactly. But there was like this is just after some cars had exploded and a news truck had exploded and there were fireworks going off. And so this is it felt really unsafe in this moment. So I actually found a way to tuck myself behind the police, get a little higher, and I was able to watch the scene unfold.
So since we're talking about this right now, and normally I would leave it till after the slides, but since we have these images up, and both of you are journalists, America for the first time over the last year or two has now been put on the list as a warning list for journalists as problematic or dangerous place for photographers, which is something that we've not ever been on. And out there, as a viewer, I am seeing images of these journalists getting hit, almost look like they're getting targeted, and every other moment you see that it's changed. So what do you think has changed? How has it changed? And where do you think the direction of this is coming from?
I think,
and I want to hear from both of you on this.
Yeah, I think that's a really, it's a hard question to answer because I think some of the stuff I think is intentional in the fact that like if police are going to fire on a crowd of protesters, like, and we can argue for days on whether they should do that or not, like some of that is like part of the job, right? You're just in the wrong place at the wrong time. There are these reports that they're getting fired on, and knowing, like we've heard like the Carolyn Cole story, you know, there's plenty of stories about people being pursued and fired upon, and you know, people are getting mugged. I've had I know 4 people who have been mugged now since Saturday. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding. I think the rhetoric that has come from this administration is put a target on the media's back. Certainly what he has said has not helped. I think, but I do think we're talking about 3 different lanes, right?
Yeah.
And I think the looting that is happening is if people are going to loot a store, right, or a CVS, and they see somebody with thousands of dollars of camera equipment, like, yeah, it makes sense that they would mug you too. Like, it's like no holds bar, right? Like when we saw people looting is when my husband and I, who's also a freelance photographer here, you know, we were in our car and we wanted to make sure that we wanted to capture that because we thought it was important, but we also wanted an easy way out. And so I think these 3 lanes have three different problems.
Jamie, I want you to address this too, because I think, you know, it's frightening that, you know, it's one thing to be a war journalist or a journalist and put yourself knowingly saying, I'm going to go and cover conflict zones. But when the conflict zone is in your backyard in America where it's not supposed to be, what's that like? And when you feel targeted, what's your feeling about this current climate?
Well, I'm going to throw a caveat out, which is, you know, I'm not a working photojournalist right now, but
and you've been around it.
Yeah. But having said that, you know, Momenta's mission has always been to support and educate and create the community of documentary photographers so that they can continue unfettered access to tell the stories that need to be told. And so what we've been doing in the last week has, I mean, I don't know about any of you guys, but I have been texting with individual photographers every night until almost midnight, you know, checking in with people, seeing how they're doing, how are they emotionally and physically handling this, you know, reaching out to people who we know have been assaulted and mugged and saying, what can I do for you? What can Momenta do for you? And I think the thing that is being lost, as Jessica was really right, there's three lanes. There's the, like, you're at a political rally and somebody puts a target on your back and says, these people are, you know, the enemy. That's different from what we're dealing with right now. And the problem is, just like what, you know, the protesters are trying so desperately to make sure is delineated, is there are looters and violent actors, and then there are protesters. And the difference between the two of them is like the difference between regular Christians and the Greensboro Baptist Church, or regular gun owners and those nut jobs that were in the, you know, Capitol building with assault rifles just to intimidate people. There is just a huge difference and nuance that needs to be said for journalists who are acting ethically and responsibly, and they should be allowed to do their job, and they should be allowed to not be targeted by looters, like Jessica said. Like, they're going to do that anyway. Those are the people who aren't there to protest because of injustice. They're there to create chaos and watch the world burn. And those are very different from the people who are targeting the journalists, and in different ways.